of all, why advocate? And I think I mostly outlined that before, but let me reiterate with some specific examples. So, first of all, again, policies affect grad students as well. And one example from what seems like decades ago is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. This was the bill that was the largest overhaul to the tax code in over 30 years. And all of you have probably heard about the big tax rate reductions for businesses and individuals. And a subset of you may have heard about this provision directly related to grad students, which would have likely increased income taxes for us by about 10K USD. I personally wasn't here then, but I heard there was a lot of movement by the External Affairs Board and the GSC as a whole. There was an emergency advocacy trip to DC by the students, and there was a lot of media interviews with the GSC president as well. And you'll see an example of this bill popping up again later in the presentation. Additionally, which is of interest to some of you, there was also that ICE ruling on July 6th, which would have forced international students, like some of us here currently in the country, who would be in online-only programs for this fall to go back to your home countries and participate in MIT activities. And the difficulties regarding that can't be understated. There are time zone differences. Some people who are here will have to break leases or pay rent from overseas, asynchronous interactions with people from MIT. All of that would have been a hindrance. But all of that to say that your voice does matter a lot. And again, this is on all ends. So there's both, it affects both international students and domestic students as well. And the work that the EAB is engaged in gets the nod from people like David Goldston from the MIT Washington office, and also from MIT President Raphael Reif as well. So he sent us a personal email thanking us for efforts, and I think this interplay between like admin and grad students, at times there may be tension, but when we join forces, cheesily speaking, we can do great things, I guess. Any thoughts, questions? Okay, so let me also say that while I'm focusing on external efficacy today, and I just talked briefly about internal efficacy before, there's also efficacy that can be done within your circle of friends, family, the people you interact with, and I take this from a seminar I was at yesterday with Trey Grayson, former Kentucky Secretary of State. He encourages people like you to have kind-natured conversations with your friends and family on things like registering to vote, having a plan to vote, and just keeping up with issues in general. So much like what you're doing right now. And you don't necessarily need to be even plugged into the local, state, federal, legislative conversations if you don't have the capacity for that, and that's very understandable. But it's all about doing what you can. Okay, so I just want to start diving into the weeds a little, but still kind of maintaining a bird's eye view of the government structure and procedures that we deal with. This may seem a bit esoteric or abstract at first, but an understanding of the different levels of government, how they operate, how they interact with each other, they will heavily inform you on how you do advocacy. So for example, you wouldn't or you should not go to Representative Aina Presley's office to advocate for more bike lanes in Cambridge or even Boston. She may be able to point you to people who deal with this sort of issues, but it's not really the best use of anyone's time. And likewise, you shouldn't be advocating for federal medicinal marijuana policy at the state house or city council. Well, maybe the state house or the city council, but state level, that's a different story. So it's about understanding where to do what and where and when. Okay, so this is a pretty dense slide, but it's a very nice graphic here. So the basic structure of the federal government is laid out in the nation's founding document, the Constitution, and it stipulates that there be three branches. So the first branch on the left here is the legislative branch, which makes laws. And the overarching body is Congress. Let me get a laser pointer up. Cool, that works. And there are so-called two houses, small h, or chambers, and one is the upper house, or the Senate, where you have you have 100 elected senators in total, 2 for each of the 50 states, and they serve 6-year terms. And you then have the lower house or the House of Representatives with a fixed number of elected representatives, 435 in total, and they serve 2-year terms. And each state gets at least one representative, and then the rest of the seats are apportioned based on the state population, relative state sizes. And the census is actually being filled this year, and the states would redraw the congressional district lines, boundaries to fit these new totals, and will take effect in 2023. The next branch here is the executive branch, which, as the name suggests, executes or carries out the laws. This is headed by the President Donald Trump of the United States, followed by the Vice President, currently Mike Pence, and the Cabinet, which includes members like the Attorney General, William Barr, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao, etc. And the Cabinet is nominated by the President and must be approved by the Senate with at least a simple majority of 51 votes. Also, speaking of votes in the Senate, the Vice President serves in, at least to me, in kind of an interesting role in the Senate in Congress, which is slightly taking more attention nowadays. Technically, he is the ex officio President of the Senate and may vote only to break a tie. And fun fact, this has happened about 270 times, 270 times in the history of the country. In the House, it's the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, or the presiding officer that breaks the tie. And I said before that we mostly do legislative advocacy, but we have done some executive advocacy before with in-person meetings with, for example, the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Dr. Kelvin Troggemeyer. And finally, you have the judicial branch, which reads, evaluates, or interprets the law or the Constitution. And the highest court in the land is the Supreme Court, which has, I guess, now 8 associate justices, and it's headed by the Chief Justice, John Roberts. There are also lower courts like the district courts, which, if any one of you know a bit of law, there are trial courts. And there are also circuit courts, which are appellate courts or courts of appeal. I won't go into the technicalities of this, but a few months ago, regarding the July 6th ICE ruling, we did a bit of what we call judicial advocacy, where we worked with a law firm to write up an amicus brief to basically give student voice and a platform for the lawsuit. And apparently the judge was very sympathetic to that. And this was, all before the government rescinded that lawsuit. So again, just wanted to emphasize we have hands in different areas, and MIT students in particular can have an outsized impact. Okay, so there's also some substructure to the Senate and the House of Representatives, and I'll first note that they're pretty similar between both chambers. So you have the leadership with the Speaker of the House, currently Nancy Pelosi, along with the House Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, and then you have the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy. And then in the Senate, there's the Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, and you have the Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer. And you also then have several committees which deals with different topics. So you have the Appropriations Committee, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and you have varying numbers of members from each party that are in each committee, and they're generally based on the proportion of the number of either representatives or chambers or senators in the chamber. And then each committee has a chair, which is the leader, so-called, and that's usually for the majority party. And then you have a ranking member, which is the same sort of leadership, but for the minority party. And then under each committee, there are also subcommittees, which specialize, home into more specific topics, and they also have their own chairs and ranking members. So for example, in the Senate, you have the Judiciary Committee, which is chaired by Senator Lindsey Graham. And under that committee, there are 6 subcommittees under it. So for example, you have the subcommittee on border security and immigration, chaired by John Cornyn. And you also have the subcommittee on the Constitution, chaired by Ted Cruz. And let me just prime a bit of as to why I'm talking about this. So you'll learn that bills or legislation in Congress are introduced through committees. So knowing who is in each committee helps you to kind of target your strategy as to who to talk to at certain points of when legislation is being passed through in Congress. Okay, so let's talk about the congressional offices themselves. So, for each of the 535 members of Congress, you have a so-called congressional office, and it's headed by the member of Congress, again, be it for a senator or a representative in the House. They're mainly assisted by their chief of staff, who is the chief of the office staffers. And there are various titles and positions in the offices. I think the titles change from office to office, kind of like a stylistic thing. But you usually have a legislative director, a communications director, schedulers, district staff, and these are the people that you will actually and personally meet with when you go to DC for meetings in non-pandemic times. You almost never meet with the member of Congress themselves. But these are the people who have the ear of the congressperson, and they are the ones who are constantly interacting with stakeholders like us, and they do a lot. They do a lot of the deep research for legislation as well, and these staffers are incredibly important in the congressional offices. Now, just for some fun pictures, just a quick word on who our representatives are. So, and this is representative of small r. So you have Elizabeth Warren, who is our senior senator. You also have Ed Markey, who is the junior senator. The senior and junior senator is kind of a technical designation about on who came into the Senate first. There's nothing more to it than that. And as I mentioned above, both of them represent Massachusetts, the state. Now, those of you who live in, so if you see from the diagram on the left here, those of you who live in the Kendall Square area around here, around MIT, the grad student or around the grad student dorms, for example, your congressional representative in the House with a big R is Ayanna Pressley. Those of you in Somerville or Cambridgeport, Harvard Square, for example, are represented by Catherine Clark. And quite fun fact, she happens to be the vice chair of the House Democratic Caucus, and she's the sixth ranked Democrat in the chamber. Okay, so how is our law made? And let's use the example of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act proposal that I talked about before at the start. So first, the bill is introduced in the House and the Senate separately. And they're referred to the relevant committee, and in this case, it is the Senate Finance Committee, and in the House is the House Ways and Means Committee. Now, then within each committee, the bill is debated, passed, and then sent to the floor in the House and Senate separately, where they will also then passed. Now, in order for the bill to be passed, in order for the bill to be sent to the president for it to be the law of the land, the bills coming out of both chambers have to be exactly the same. And if the bills are different from the House and the Senate version, a so-called conference committee is formed. And it's literally just a bunch of people from the Senate and the House coming together to hash out the differences. And then once that final version is written up and agreed on, the bill goes through another vote. And once that is passed through the House and Senate, it goes to the president for them to sign. So that's sometimes this takes months, and I'm summarizing here in like a minute. So your mileage may vary. Let me stop here for any questions. So the first thing I'll note is that the structure of the government is dictated by the Constitution. So, that was ratified in, I think, 1787. And that really lays out all of the legislative structure in the country, the different branches of government. And you may have heard of this concept of checks and balances by the different branches. So, that's the structure itself. If you want to if you want to convert to a different structure like the parliamentary democracy, or like something, like a parliamentary system as you see in the UK or in European countries, then you need to have like a different constitution. And
It's impossible.
I'm sure that there are senators or representatives that might want this. But as you may suspect, this will take a big overhaul of the entire country and of the system, and I definitely don't see that happening anytime soon. I also got another question on the chat. How are members assigned to committees? Also another very good question. So let me go back to this diagram. So the members are assigned to committees through the leadership. So I forgot there's a specific committee for this, but it's mainly the leadership that decides on who is assigned to which committee. Sometimes they look at the backgrounds of the various representatives and the senators and throw them into the committees that they are that they know about. Sometimes you just get thrown into a committee that you don't have anything about, but you kind of learn on the job, which may or may not be a good thing. Sometimes people who have a background in things, they may have a certain disposition about how to do things. Sometimes you need a fresh perspective. But the short answer is that it's mostly up to the leadership. Any more questions before I move on to the state side? Cool. Okay, so what I said before, that's kind of most of what you really need to know on the federal side. Now onto the state aspect. So I'll quickly say first that while we do have limitations, so I'll talk about advocacy trips next week, and we have limitations on the number of people we send to DC, mainly because of the money. But we don't have that problem for the State House, because the State House, if those of you have been to Boston, it's literally just across the river, so there's no limit on who we can send. But anyhow, the structure, the topics covered, the legislative procedure, they're actually pretty similar between the state and federal ends. They're not exactly the same, of course, but in terms of the general idea, you kind of pretty much got it already. There are some interesting idiosyncrasies. For example, many state legislatures around the country are part-time, though the Massachusetts legislature is usually in session for most parts of the year. Another important difference for us to keep in mind is that there are different rules governing how legislation is introduced around the different state houses in the country. So for example, in the Massachusetts State House, there is a specific legislative calendar. The legislators are actually given a short window on when they can introduce legislation in the State House. I can go into the details, but if you are a fan of John Oliver, he gives a wonderful 17-minute segment on state legislatures. You can search that on YouTube. So for the Massachusetts state government, again, the structure is pretty similar to the federal level. You have the legislative branch, executive branch, and the judicial branch. In the legislative branch, you have exactly the same thing with the Senate and the House of Representatives. There are 40 state senators, and there are 160 state representatives. And then in the executive branch, you have the governor and the lieutenant governor, much like the president and the vice president on the federal level. You also have the attorney general, the secretary of the Commonwealth, or the secretary of state, and some other positions as well. On the judicial side, you have the equivalent of the Supreme Court or the Supreme Judicial Court. You have also the Appeals Court and the Trial Court as well, and various other lower courts. Now, okay, as you can see from the map on the left, if you remember what I showed you before, with regards to the state districts, they are split up differently. If you remember the map that I showed you regarding the congressional districts, the state districts are split up differently to the congressional district. Most of us are represented by Jay Livingstone, which is actually this person over here on the right. And you also have Mike Connolly on the left here, and you also have Marjorie Decker, which I don't think we have a picture of. And yes, here are some various examples of state representatives that we've taken a picture with. Here's me, which you can see I'm very short, so that's one way to identify me. And it's very, I was saying on the federal level, you almost never meet the congressional people in person, at least for meetings. But on the state side, sometimes you may, get lucky, especially if they have time. They will sit down and listen to all the issues that you're wondering about, and they give you like inside information as to what's happening on the floor, what's happening behind leadership, and what sort of conversations are being done behind the scenes. So I think that's pretty cool. Now, onto local governments. As you are probably suspecting, there's a lot of variance behind this. But generally, they do meet on a local basis, and they have a similar legislative procedure to the state and federal level. And recently, there's, as some of you are also concerned about this, there's been a lot of chatter on police reform and the affordable housing overlay. In fact, as I was saying before, we'll hear from Mayor Sumbu Siddiqui in the policy panel, where among other things, she'll tell us about the issues that she's thinking about and is tackling along with the other members of the city council, and also how we students can best target our advocacy strategy. Now, I'll also say that thanks to COVID-19, one of the small silver linings, forcing all of us to rethink how we do things. Most, if not all, of the meetings are now online via Zoom. Some of them, are Zoom meetings. Some of them are webinars. And if you go to the website here, and if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see the list of various meetings and Zoom information as well. And some of them you have to register in advance, but you can now just stay at home, log into the Zoom meetings, and participate or just listen in to the various meetings that they're having. I assume that a fair number of them are like procedural and boring, but once they get into talking about the various issues, that's I'm sure when people are paying attention. So for the structure of the Cambridge government, you have the city council. This is headed by the mayor, Sumbu Siddiqui, who is also the chief legislative officer. There are 8 other members of the council, and I think there's a picture in the next slide about who they are. The council is also organized into various committees, which are very similar to the federal level. They do research, they do legislative analysis on the major policy issues. Under the council, there is the city manager office, who is responsible for the administration of the departments and services, like what you see here with the finance or human services or public safety. And they also implement or execute the council legislation. And these are the people that you mainly go to for things like citizen inquiries, requests, and they coordinate with the city departments to conduct neighborhood meetings, like the ones I kind of mentioned before. And sometimes you see notices around the city as well. And I was just saying, you have here Mayor Sumbu Siddiqui, which you'll hear from next the following Wednesday. Lana Malone, the vice mayor, and then 7 other members of the city council. Some of you who were here a few years ago may recognize Mark McGovern's name. He was the previous mayor, and I especially like his name because of the word govern in there, but anyhow. Okay, so I just threw at you over the last 30 minutes a whole slew of information about who's what where, who's who, but I haven't yet talked about the how, and this is the next thing. And I'll stop here to see if there are any questions about the structures, the federal, state, local structures that I was talking about before. Okay. Cool. Excellente. Okay, so one of the first questions to ask when you want to get involved in the process is, when or where should I get involved? And this varies by issue. Sometimes you gotta this comes a bit of experience as well, but you kind of learn to see when you should get involved into talking with the relevant people. There's also a bit of technique about the frequency at which you are interacting with the relevant staffers. So maybe during crunch time you're interacting with them daily or once every few days, but otherwise it depends. But the overarching point is that once a bill is introduced, you should start doing some outreach to extend the impact. So at first, targeting committee members is crucial, and who you ask, and I'll share that real soon. By committee members, though, I don't mean directly reaching out to the actual Congress people. So as I was saying before, you mainly be talking to the people in the offices, so the key congressional staffers working behind the scenes. And again, these are very important people because they have the ear of the congressman or congresswoman that they work under, and they are also I guess also the Congress people, they are the ones that are directly accountable to the constituents and speak on the floor and vote in the end. So the staffers are these key intermediaries between us and the Congress people. Now again, then once the bill is passed in the various committees and then through the House and Senate floors, if the bills are passed and they're not exactly the same, then they're sent to this conference committee, and you at that point you'll be targeting whoever's in the conference committee, and this means being proactive in actually finding out who the conference committee members are. They may not be the same Congress people that you were originally talking to, so just some basic research, basic Googling will bring up this information as well. And yeah, I'll soon be talking about the tracking aspect. So for example, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, once we found out that there was a provision that would have added $10,000 in extra income taxes to us, we jumped straight into DC. I wasn't, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, I wasn't here for this, but from what I remember hearing, and if Jordan knows more, you're welcome to pipe up and add to it. So they were targeting the various committee members, and so the one thing to note as well is that with this particular provision, this provision was in the House version, but not the Senate version. And from conversations that we had with people on the Hill, the senators, they brought our argument saying that this would harm graduate students, and it was not only going to harm us on the financial aspect, even though that would be the immediate consequence, but on the long term, you will have fewer grad students that would drive the innovation and research in this country. And this is what we all are, right? We are the ones that are doing the so-called the quote unquote dirty work, the grunt work on the ground for research. And if we are gone, the innovation landscape around the country would have been deteriorated. And the senators, they didn't put this provision into the bill, not because they wanted, they knew that it would affect us. They just didn't put it in. And so the senators bought that, and the senators got in touch with some of the people in the House, and they kind of talked back and forth. And it turns out that people in the House, they kind of just tacked it on. They didn't really think about it per se. It's not like they wanted. It's not like they were out to harm graduate students. And once they found out that it wasn't going to be that much money anyways to add into the tax bill, finally they threw that provision out of the bill, and we kind of breathed a huge sigh of relief. And I remember, I was applying to grad school at the end of 2017, and I was very keenly keeping track of this, right? So if this somehow came into effect, I don't think I'll be here today, because I'm not gonna forgo $10,000 extra dollars a year because of me having to pay more taxes. Okay, so there are also more examples that I can bring up. So Benjamin Lane, the External Affairs Board Vice Chair, can give you way more examples than I can, because he is by far the most plugged into this. So let's see. A relatively recent example would be HR 1194 as well, the Graduate Student Savings Act of 2019. So right now, the grad stipend, well, not right now, sorry. Before this bill, the grad stipends from fellowships were not considered taxable compensation. So that means that you could not have put any of that money to things like retirement funds. You cannot put it into tax advantaged IRAs or individual retirement accounts to start saving for retirement. And just a small point, you should be thinking about that. The language in the bill would have made any amount paid to grad students in grad school taxable compensation and would allow all grad students to save for retirement. And the story behind that is that we've written up something called a statement, which I'll talk about in the next workshop. But the idea is that we basically endorse the bill and we urge its passage through Congress. I'm not exactly sure how the statement was disseminated in the end, but anyhow, the language from this Graduate Student Savings Act of 2019, I got included or attached as an amendment to an appropriations bill by Representative Nita Lowy, who is the Appropriations Committee Chairwoman, under the prompt of Representative Joe Kennedy. And in the end, we sent a note to sent a note of thanks to Representative Kennedy. So what's the point I'm trying to make here? The point is that the officers know, us doing this form of outreach to them means that the officers know that we are paying attention, but not just paying attention, but we're also actively engaged in the process. I think Benjamin may or may not have had meetings with some relevant officers about this, among other issues as well. And the idea is just to give the staffers and then subsequently the Congress people, the grad students' perspectives on issues that we either really care about or are affecting us in some form of tangible way. Okay, so now that you know when and or where you should get involved in the process, at least like in a nebulous fashion, what should you do once you're in a meeting, right? Or what should you ask for? So there are various suggestions here. So for example, you can ask them to introduce a piece of legislation, which is actually a very big ask. But smaller asks include things like asking them to sponsor a legislation or co-sponsor legislation, which is kind of like an official way of endorsing a legislation, putting it on the record. And then you also have things like, making amendments or speaking on the floor for the various issues, writing a so-called Dear Colleague letter and disseminating this around the chambers, voting for or against the legislation at various stages of it, suggesting like hearings, witnesses, submitting reports, doing extra research from the Congressional Research Service, and there's probably a couple more as well. Now, note that what I've listed all here, they're all very specific, right? So if you just walk up to Ayanna Presley's office and say, "Hey, I care about climate change. I care about research funding. I support police reform." That's all. That's all very good, right? Because they know your positions, they know what you're for, but there's actually nothing actionable or specific in there. Nothing that can be translated to real legislative action. By whatever means that the congressperson can do. So being clear, being succinct about your asks, that's part of the strategy, and this should be planned beforehand. I say this, thinking that it's easy. It's definitely not. I'll just say that when I came into the External Affairs Board, I've had zero experience doing any of this. Not in New Zealand, not anywhere I've been, and don't really talk to my parents about this as well. Increasingly so, but didn't really talk about this with friends or whoever. And coming to EAB, learning more about these things, they we will really like talk about the process with you. I wouldn't, maybe I wouldn't say slowly because things are moving very quickly, but we certainly take the time to explain to you the process, who to talk to, what to talk about. And it's naturally natural to be nervous for these sort of things in your first time. But once you do this a few times, you will kind of get the hang of it. So one example is that in my first trip to DC, I think I was a part of like 20 meetings, which is actually a hell lot, 20 meetings over 2 days. And I fumbled over the first and second meeting, fumbled to the point where one of my colleagues had to step in for me and say what I was appointed to say. I felt a bit bad, but then by the time I got to the second or third meeting, I could basically just recite the points, list the specific facts, etc. And sorry, lost my train of thought for a bit. You get a hang of it once you do this a couple of times, even after one or two times. Let me stop there to see if there are any questions, thoughts, comments. I see Jordan had a comment as well. Okay. So which officers can or do you contact? Well, you can contact any office, really, but you're more likely to get a response if you're a constituent of the officers that represent either where you live or where you vote. Political officers, like I said, they generally do want to hear from us. So grad students, they are we are a population that historically not really engaged in things like these because uh, things like we're too young or we're just too busy or we just don't care, and that's not entirely true, and we're increasingly getting more and more engaged in issues like this. But they do want to hear from us because our perspectives are unique, and yeah, and we're an increasingly valuable voice, and the MIT name has a bit of weight attached to it as well. So but we are constituents nonetheless. So what about international students? Well, we are still constituents of Congressional District, 5 or 7 under Aina Presley or Catherine Clark, and you're also constituents of the state. When I went to DC the last year, we got meetings with almost all of the Massachusetts representatives and senators except for one. And I was the one who reached out to them, mainly because I haven't lived in any other state before. But also, I'm a constituent in the state. We pay taxes, and yeah, they do want to listen to us. So for the various things that you're working on, it's important to reach out to committee staffers, particularly those of the majority party, since they're the ones that generally control what happens, and they have massive influence over their other members. And this also means, again, I was saying before, getting in touch with the committee or committee chairs, since they have direct jurisdiction over the bills. Okay, so regarding advocacy methods, resources, how to actually I talked about who's who where, kind of like what to do, what to ask for, but then the next thing is, okay, I have an email drafted, but who do I send this to? How do I send this to? Who do I call? And yeah, I guess this is the next slide here. So there are a few ways to go about this. One is to do the old-fashioned direct phone call to your state or congressional offices, and numbers you can find on their websites as well. You won't necessarily directly reach the congressperson, and I don't think you really do at all, ever, but you'll be heard from a receptionist, and they will provide some general feedback, and they will also make a record of that. It may seem like for naught, because you're just one person calling about one specific issue, but these officers, they really do take your comments and stories seriously. So, sometimes if it's a story that meshes well with what they're trying to talk about, sometimes they really talk about it on the floor. On the floor, they're saying something like, oh, I received a call from this constituent a few weeks ago about a certain issue, and this is their story. And, stories really make a huge impact. We are a majority STEM school, and we really thrive on like statistics, facts. We like to put out numbers like 15%, numbers, yada yada yada. But these are very dry, much like what I've been, my presentation for the last 45 minutes. But what people or what Congress people really like to hear are stories. And if you have if you organize some sort of call campaign about an issue and you have all these stories, these collective numbers, they really do make an impact. And to kind of summarize this, power is people and people is power. So we really have this power in our hands. Now, if you want to email a specific staffer, especially if you're trying to set up meetings, or if you're trying to get through to a person specifically, you can look through the list of staffers of Congress people or committees through the National Journal Almanac, which can be accessible via campus or via the VPN. So let me go to that right now. I do not want to, not my sunglasses collection. Okay. Wait, did I just actually go to the wrong one? Wait, hold on, give me a second. Can someone give me a thumbs up if this is the right? Okay, good. Actually, I can see on my iPad. So this should be visible. So let me go to the main page. So if you go to a VPN or if you're on campus right now, you can go onto the National Journal, and you can go to something called the Almanac. Sorry, I'm lagging. If you go to the Almanac, you see something like this. Okay, so what you are seeing here is, basically the Congress people. So, you see people like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, etc. And what you're gonna do is that, if you want to say talk to a staffer from Ed Markey's office, who is one of the senators from Massachusetts, you just enter Ed Markey, click on his name, and then you'll be brought to this page, and you'll see things like his profile, maybe personal email, social media, a short bio, more social media, office contact information, etc. The two things that you want to be paying attention to, especially when you're thinking about your advocacy strategy, your committees, right? So here you have the list of committees that Senator Ed Markey is a part of. So you see things like he's part of the Small Business Committee, Commerce, Science and Transportation, Environment and Public Works, Foreign Relations. So this is where he has direct influence, and by direct influence I meant in terms of voting legislation out of these committees. So knowing this is really important as well. If you know which committees he's not on, then you don't have to, or you should not, I would say, kind of like waste time talking to the staffers. And then up here you have staff. So you have actual emails of the staffers, and you have the positions and the sort of areas that they're interested in. So for example, if you were talking about you want to talk about research funding, you probably you probably look for someone who's into like either education or science, and maybe even depends on what legislation you're talking about. So okay, let's go to science first. Okay, RIP, they do not have science. So as I was saying before, a couple of slides back, the names of the staffers, they generally change. If you don't see science here, doesn't mean that they don't care about science. It just merely means that they kind of break it out into different groups. So let me backtrack and let's say go to the environment. If there's some like climate change / environmental justice legislation. So you have a whole bunch of people here to contact, and the first point of order is that you want to set up a meeting. So say for example, you're going to DC in 2 weeks, and you want to set up a meeting with them. You just email them saying things like, hey, hi, or dear whoever, I'm Mason, I'm a grad student at MIT. Add little things also like, Senator Ed Markey is a leader in the Senate on environmental issues, and that's actually true. And there's a legislation that I care about, and the grad students at MIT really care about, and I would like 30 minutes of your time on this date to talk to you about this. Do you have some time? And then there's some back and forth about when those meetings are set up. Sometimes there are clashes, whatever. Again, I'll talk about the details of the meetings themselves in the next workshop, but this is generally how you start approaching this. Are there any questions as I go back to the slides? So you can track the various bills you're interested in, through govtrack.us. There's also congress.gov.gov. Congress.gov, and you can see things like, what your congressperson of interest or your congressperson is interested in, what they support, what the status of various bills are. So for example, if you are interested in, or I guess an example, if you're interested in the National Defense Authorization Act, you can go and check, whether it's passed the House, whether it's passed the Senate, whether whether in committee or whether they've actually been signed by the president already. Okay, so and here are more resources as well to keep track of certain policies and issues within some defined area. So for example, GovTrack, which I just mentioned, is more generic and all-encompassing, whereas the American Institute of Physics, as you may suspect, focuses more on news and/or legislation on science, research funding. They probably won't have issues like pension funds, I imagine. I don't know. But I'm sure there are various websites increasingly as well across the country that kind of tracks based on various issues. And there are also various websites for the state and local level as well. So the MA legislature is the same thing for Congress.gov, but for the state level, tracking bills, who's supporting which bill and the stages the bills are at. And then earlier on, I was talking about the Cambridge level system. There's a hearing schedule, meeting information, Zoom information. Again, these are all virtual now. You can attend any of these. I'm not sure about the federal level hearings, actually. I'm not sure if you can dial into them. I haven't heard any of this. I assume not, but happy to be proven wrong as well, because they seem pretty cool to kind of jump inside. Okay, so anyways, over the last 45 minutes hour or so, I threw at you a whole bunch of information, resources, etc. And I'm happy to send around these slides either later today or tomorrow. And I'll just summarize by saying that we at the EAB are working on a hell of a lot of things that I may have alluded to before. I gave some examples as well, but we're also working on some COVID-19 related stuff, NFF reauthorization, international student related issues, and more. And this is just on the federal level as well. If you have any ideas, anything you'd like to pursue, I highly encourage you to come along to one of our meetings. In fact, the Broad External Affairs Board itself is having a meeting at Friday at 3 p.m. And the link is down here. You can also send an email to gac-eab@mit.edu, which would go to Benjamin, the GSC president, as well as Jordan, and they can add you onto the generic mailing list. There's also a calendar that's down here. Well, that's in the link at the bottom, and you can look at the calendars of meetings that we have. Let me reiterate that international students can and should get involved in this type of advocacy work. The only things that we legally can't do are vote or donate to campaigns. We are still constituents. We matter. We have a voice as well. We have impact. Most of the staffers on the Hill, they are receptive to what we say, and by we I don't mean domestic students as well. I mean international students. So there are times where I have introduced myself as an international student, and they're generally they're a bit more impressed by that, because international students tend to be apathetic about all of this. Again, with things of the last few years, increasingly less apathetic. But we're kind of for the lack of a better term, a novelty. So we do matter. They do listen to us. Sometimes I may not divulge that. There's some staffers, officers that may not like that, and I have been on the receiving end on one or two of these. But they're very rare, and they're the minority. But but either way, we're still MIT students nonetheless. So it's a matter of targeting the strategy. Is this the right slide? Okay, so yeah, anyways, I hope that was all roughly okay. As I said, this week's was a bit dry. And I'm still planning for next week's session, but I'm hoping to design something a bit more interactive or a bit more fun, and but also something not too cringy. I'm trying to be wary of that. So next week we'll be focusing on meetings, calls, the sort of the follow-ups as well with the political officers, along with some info on advocacy trips that we take. And we'll also talk about the GSE policy platform. If you don't know what this is, first of all, I mean I do, but anyhow, I will also share that with you next week. And yeah, I this went a lot quicker than I thought. So I will stay around for a bit to take questions, or if you want to hear about various stories, etc. But otherwise, hope to see you next week, and have a good rest of your week, everyone.